So welcome to Rice Creek. I'm Kristen Haynes, the assistant director here. It's really great to see everyone here to celebrate trees and healthy ecosystems and yeah, just have a fun day celebrating all of that. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Molly Jacobson. Molly is ESS Pollinator Ecologist. So she is part of both the Bee Lab and the Restoration Science Center on ESS campus, and is doing some phenomenal things through those organizations, promoting and creating habitat in places that didn't have habitat before, and in a lot of places like turning lawns into meadows and working on right-of-ways. And yeah, I think I have so much respect for Molly's work and the work that's coming out of ESF. So today we're excited to hear about how some trees and forests, as well as other plants, can support bees and not just the flowers. So with that, I'll turn it over to Molly.
Well, I hope you're all enjoying your day here so far. As you said, my name is Molly Jacobson. I'm the pollinator ecologist at ESF. I work in our Bee Lab there, and I also co-chair our campus's chapter for the Campus USA program. And today I'm going to introduce you to some of New York's native pollinators, as well as how woody plants are really important for supporting them, and how we can do some of that right in our own yards. So pollinators are incredibly diverse here in New York, much more than you might think. Bees are probably our most well-known pollinators, but I would say most of us can probably only name a few different kinds. But we have over 450 different kinds of bees here in New York, including all of the ones that you see here. And in the US as a whole, there are over 3,600 different kinds of bees. Each one plays a unique role in its ecosystem and has unique relationships with native plants. We will spend much of this talk looking closer at bees. But we also have many other kinds of insect pollinators, like our native wasps, which includes our potter wasps, red-waisted wasps, sand wasps, yellow jackets, and many more, which are all common flower visitors in gardens. And we have butterflies and moths, collectively known as the Lepidoptera. Both of these can be pollinators, although moths outnumber butterflies in species diversity 20-1. Our sphinx moths in particular can be important as both daytime and nighttime pollinators. Flies are pretty underappreciated pollinators, though they're very common and very diverse. Most of our fly pollinators are in this family called Syrphidae, or the hoverflies. And as you can see, many of them like to mimic bees and wasps. So this one up in the top here is the bald-faced hornet fly. One of my favorite little mimics there. These guys help farmers too, as the larvae of many of these species are aphid predators, so they are important biocontrol as well. And lastly, our beetles, in particular the flower longhorn beetles. Many of these, again, mimic bees and wasps. And as an adult, they spend their time on flowers, but as larvae, they are important decomposers of dead wood in our forests. So these are very forest-associated insects. Now, native pollinators are important to protect for a variety of reasons, not least of all that they are diverse and beautiful in their own right, but they also pollinate the wild plants that make up our ecosystems and that create food and habitat for other animals that we admire or rely on, like birds and mammals. Even aquatic habitats with fish and amphibians rely indirectly on the work of pollinators. They're fed by organic matter that falls into streams from plants in the surrounding uplands. Native pollinators also play a pretty underappreciated role in agriculture, which is a space where the conversation is usually dominated by European honeybees. But over and over again, research has found that having a diversity of pollinators improves crop pollination and yield, and that native bees outperform honeybees when it comes to pollinating many of our key fruit crops like cherries, apples, blueberries, squashes, tomatoes, and many others. So our food security depends on having wild pollinators and the billions of dollars that they give us in free services every year. Ecosystems and agriculture alike would suffer tremendously without our wild pollinators. So let's dive a little bit into the life history of our native bees. Most of what you've probably learned about bees comes from honeybees, but honeybees are actually really unique in the bee world. They have what's called advanced eusociality. So they live in these large multi-year colonies with a division of labor like workers and queens, and they produce things that are valuable to us like wax and honey. But almost no other bees on Earth live like this. Out of the 450 species in our state, the only native colonial bees are bumblebees and some sweat bees. Their colonies are much, much smaller, and they only last a single year. So they don't make any honey because they don't need any sort of long-term energy storage. The vast majority of our native bees, around 3/4 of all species, are completely solitary. And that means there's just a single female that does all of the work herself. She will emerge as an adult and mate with a male, and then build a nest with many different chambers in it. She'll then go out to flowers to collect pollen, roll that pollen into a ball, and lay an egg on each one. She'll then do this over and over again and close up the nest. And that's the last she will ever see of her future offspring, because these solitary bees only live as adults for a few short weeks. Those eggs will then hatch underground into larvae that eat the pollen that was left for them, and then usually overwinter before pupating and emerging as an adult at the same time their parents did last year. And that is really the life cycle of the average wild bee that we have all around us here in the Northeast. So where are all of these bees? Well, most of them are actually right beneath our feet. Nearly 3/4 of all bees nest in the ground. And these solitary bee nests are tiny, no more than the width of a pencil, and there's only a single bee in each one. These ground nesting solitary bees are completely non-aggressive. They will not come out and sting to defend their nest. And some, like our mining bees here, will form what's called nesting aggregations, which is where many individuals, sometimes anywhere from dozens to millions of individuals, will all make their nests right next to each other, but they remain separate. They're not connected in any way. And they'll do this when there's really good nesting habitat around, like a big patch of bare soil, a south-facing hillside, or often a hiking trail. Since these bees are only active for a few weeks, once they close up their nests, all evidence they were there disappears until the same time next year. We also have some bees that do nest above ground. Some of them like to use dead plant stems, and they are looking for stems that will persist through the winter and that are either hollow or have a soft pith that they can excavate. Others will use pre-existing cavities in logs or wood, or other man-made structures like any sorts of cracks in our building foundations, maybe a fence, or even a bee hotel that we put up. Each species usually has a distinct preference. If you've ever seen what looks like these holes cut from leaves like Virginia creeper, redbud, or rose bushes, those are from leafcutter bees, which use those leaf pieces to divide up the chambers in their cavity nests.
They cut around it?
They use these huge mandibles that help them actually cut the leaf piece, and they fly off of it. Yes, it's fun to watch.
Yeah.
And lastly, we have some bees that don't make any nest at all. These are the cuckoo bees, or kleptoparasites. These are, for bee researchers, these are the most fun bees. So these bees lay their eggs in another bee's nest, and their larva will eat the pollen that was meant for the host larva. This is not what most people picture when they think of pollinators, but this is actually a really common and successful strategy for bees. And this lifestyle has evolved over and over again across different bee families, which is why all of these cuckoo bees look nothing alike because they're not even related to each other. Here in New York, we even have parasitic bumblebees that take over the nests of other kinds of bumblebees. There are actually more kinds of cuckoo bees in the world than bees that live in hives. So that helps us recalibrate sort of what the average bee really is. These cuckoo bees tend to be host specific. So one kind of cuckoo goes after one kind of host bee, and that makes them very closely tied to the welfare of that host. For that reason, for ecologists, this makes them good bioindicators of healthy habitats. For there to be a lot of cuckoo bees around, there needs to be healthy populations of many other kinds of bees. When these guys go, that's often a warning sign that something bad is happening in that ecosystem. So we love to see these guys around.
Do they move very often from their habitats? Like so when they lay 3 or 4 eggs, do they sort of stay within like a certain, or do they like go off to?
They're very localized. You will usually find them right around the nests or nesting aggregations of their host bee. All bees will disperse longer than we think, wider than we think to find new habitats, but generally they are very closely associated. You'll find them right at the nest of their host bee. Sometimes you can actually follow them to find the nest of a bee, which is fun to do in the springtime. So this here is one of our nomada nomad cuckoo bees, and there's the nest of host right there in the nest. And that's why many bees sit at the edge of the nest watching to not let any of the cuckoos in. So it's really dramatic. If they leave the nest at all, they're waiting to go right in.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, there's a lot of drama always going on. And so now we can look at how bees and other pollinators interact with plants. So they are relying on all sorts of cues to help tell them what flowers are worth foraging on and that have the right food for them or their offspring. This could be a flower's ultraviolet signature, pollen chemistry, or the size of a flower patch. And a big factor that determines what flowers the pollinator will visit is the combination of body size and tongue length. So if you've never seen a bee tongue before, kind of hard to see, but this sweat bee is sticking hers out at the camera. It's this really cool, long elbow-shaped thing that retracts back into a hole in their head. Fun to look at under the microscope, certainly. And so, our beetles, our wasps, and our flies have really short tongues, whereas butterflies, moths, and hummingbird pollinators all have very long tongues. Bees vary a lot from both in size and in structure. So here's an example of one of our mining bees with a much shorter tongue and a very different shaped tongue as well. And obviously flowers come in all sorts of different shapes. So this body size plus tongue length really limits what flowers they can easily access. So when we see a field like this, which has a lot of flat and shallow flowers, things in the aster family, the carrot family, maybe shrubs like dogwoods and viburnums that have flat panicles of flowers, this is where we have short-tongued pollinators like sweat bees and solitary wasps that are going to be able to access these really easily. When we have flowers like these, though, it's only larger insects with longer tongues that can pry those open and reach the resources inside. So ultimately, what we want to see in a healthy habitat is a diversity of flower shapes to support all of these different groups of pollinators in the same habitat. Now, these things matter when it comes to attracting adult pollinators and making sure they are physically compatible with a flower. But those adult bees eat something different than their young, and the adults have a lot more choices. They're there to get that sugary nectar for themselves, but they also need that protein-filled pollen for their larvae. And the limiting factor for most pollinators is that larval food source. I like to use this picture of the mining bee as an example because this is elderberry she's nectaring on. That's kind of what that white pollen is on her face there. But if you look at her back legs, they are covered in that bright orange pollen, which is clearly from a different plant. And that is the pollen that she actually collected and is taking back to the nest. She decided to visit this elderberry just to drink nectar. For whatever reason, she didn't want to collect the pollen from it. And that is the case for a lot of plants. They are acting mainly as nectar sources instead of pollen sources. And so while nectar is important, it's not usually where the bottleneck is. So when we plant for pollinators, we need to remember to provide the food for the larvae. That is, whether that's pollen for bees, leaves for caterpillars, or vogs for longhorn beetles. And so with that, I'd like to introduce the concept of specialists. Not all flowers are made equal for pollinators, as we've seen, but when it comes to getting that pollen they need for their young, bees can be generalists or specialists. So if we imagine the sunflower here is in our gardens, here we see some common eastern bumblebees, Bombus impatiens. We all have these in our gardens. They're one of the most common and generalist native bees that we have. Right now they're on the sunflower, but they can just as easily go to a different plant and collect pollen from that too. They actually like having a lot of choices because flower pollen differs quite a lot in its nutrient content across different species. So if we didn't plant sunflowers again in our yards that next year, we would still see these bees around just on a different flower. But here's another bee you might see on the same sunflower. This is a longhorn bee, one that specializes on sunflowers and just a few other plants in the aster family. So if we stopped planting the sunflower, most likely we would lose this bee from our gardens. It evolved to feed its young just the pollen from sunflowers. And even though it physically is compatible with many other flowers and it might visit them to drink nectar, it won't collect that pollen for the nest. And here's one last bee, the sunflower mining bee. You know it's important when it has the name of the sunflower right in its scientific name. This is also a specialist on sunflowers, but it's a lot rarer because it doesn't use the garden variety annual sunflowers that we tend to plant. This one only uses our native perennial sunflowers, like woodland sunflower here, which is not common in the wild and not a lot of people yet plant them in their gardens. So specialists can target plants at the family level, the genus level, or even a one-to-one species relationship. And the more narrow that association is, the more that specialist could be at risk if habitat destruction or invasive species wipes out patches of its host plant. They can't just switch to eating something else because evolution has locked them into this one food source. And here in the Northeast, around a fifth of all our bees are these diet specialists. That might not seem like very much, but in New York, that comes out to around 90 species of bees that are strictly dependent on just a narrow range of plants. They're only active as adults for the short window each year when their host plant is blooming. We even have many bees that are tied just to certain habitats because that is where their host plant grows. They need a certain soil type for nesting, or often it's due to factors we still don't fully understand. These relationships are really some of the most complex and fascinating in the pollinator world. They're why researchers like me love to study bees. And personally, I think they really show us how native pollinators are inseparable from the land around us. Here's just a few examples of some of the cool specialists that we have in our area. So in springtime, pretty soon, we have the blueberry cellophane bee, which only collects pollen from blueberries and only nests in sandy soil. In summer, we have the pickerelweed short-faced bee, which is only found in freshwater marshes where its host plant pickerelweed grows. You'll need to get into canoes usually to find this one. And in the fall, we have the hairy-banded mining bee, one of many bees that only visits goldenrod. So while the concept of specialist bees might be new for a lot of people, we tend to be more familiar with this in butterflies and moths. So this monarch here, as an adult, is happy to drink nectar from many of our garden plants, but it is limited by what its caterpillar eats. That monarch caterpillar evolved to digest the defensive compounds in milkweed and only milkweed. So if we want to conserve monarchs, we need to provide the host plant for the caterpillar. The adults have much wider options for nectar sources. And this is really just the same principle. The unique chemicals that are in pollen or in leaves can lead pollinators to co-evolve with that plant over time and eventually make them into specialists that are dependent on that plant. Now, most butterfly and moth caterpillars are these specialists. And so for pollinator habitat to be effective, we need to include the host plants. Otherwise, we're only offering nectar, and that doesn't help them make the next generation. This has huge ripple effects across ecosystems, because not only are caterpillars future pollinators, but they're also a critical link in the food web that supports countless wildlife, especially our songbirds. One pair of chickadees will feed their chicks more than 9,000 caterpillars from hatching to fledging. And researchers found that yards that are less than 70% native plants don't make enough caterpillars to support breeding bird populations. We are seeing massive declines in songbirds, especially insect-eating birds, across North America. And it is tied directly to the loss of habitat and the loss of this particular food source that they rely on. So when we garden and landscape in a way that helps pollinators, we are also helping songbirds and entire ecosystems as well. And so to protect pollinators, we need to keep their relationships with native plants intact. And we can do that by helping native plants flourish in our yards, our gardens, and around our communities. Our pollinators need all different kinds of habitats. Each one has flowers that bloom at different times and provide a key part of what pollinators need. Some bees, like our bumblebees, will travel across the landscape over the course of the season, while others are only found in one habitat each. And this is where woody plants start to enter our picture. Around 2/3 of all the bees in the eastern US rely on forests for all or part of their life cycles. And that makes sense because this land was originally mostly forested. Our trees can be some of the first sources of nectar and pollen early in the spring for pollinators. Sometimes this isn't even from the flowers. So our earliest flying bee is the frigid mining bee here, and they come out mid-March, and if there's no flowers blooming, they will go to sap runs on sugar maples to drink the sap and get the sugars that they need. So this was about 6 or 7 males, all waiting for the females to come out, and they were just hanging out on sugar maple all day. And nothing better to do. And really, I think no bees probably rely on forests more than our mining bees. Really, these are bees of the forest. We have over 90 species of mining bees here in New York, and most of them are spring flying and forest associated. They are really the workhorses of woody plant pollination, and they're often foraging right in the treetops above our heads and we don't even know it. So when we plant for pollinators, we want to try and mimic this changing of the seasons that we see on the larger landscape. This is called bloom turnover, having flowers blooming back to back across the whole season, using both shallow and deep flowers to support those different groups of pollinators. This helps support spring, summer, and fall pollinators that are each out for only a few weeks. If we don't have anything blooming then, we will lose that set of pollinators. It also supports our native social bees like bumblebees, which are out all season and need a constant supply of pollen and nectar. In the springtime, the bulk of the plants filling this niche are our trees and shrubs. The other plants that bloom this early are those spring woodland ephemerals, which themselves are forest-dependent plants that leaf up and flower and senesce all before the canopy leaves out and blocks the sun. So on multiple fronts, forested habitats are really critical for pollinators in the springtime. Now there are woodies that bloom in mid and late summer, but not nearly as many. Some of those include roses, buttonbush, chestnut trees, and witch hazel, among others. Now these here are just some pollinator favorites that you might have seen before on the recommended plant lists if you've ever looked up what to plant in pollinator gardens. They attract a lot of different pollinators. I certainly have most of these in my garden, so no shade to them at all. But they are mostly midsummer blooming, and there's almost never any woody plants on these lists. So the woody plants tend to get glossed over, especially when in our minds our picture of pollinator habitat is usually a sunny meadow. I would argue that a pollinator garden is incomplete if these types of plants are the only ones that we have. If we think back to the importance of pollen sources for native bees, these here are just some of the most common plants where bees get their pollen, especially our bumblebees, many of which are at risk. You'll see here the plant families that I've bolded are all woody plants. Things like blueberries, blackberries, willows, oaks, and maples, among many others. Bees will even collect pollen from cottonwoods and pine trees. So woody plants are really helping to offer that critical food for the next generation. If we look more specifically at our specialist bees, we see here up top the 4 most important plants for specialists in the Northeast. 2 of those top 4 are woody plants, the willows and the blueberries, which help support the spring cohort of specialists, whereas the goldenrods and asters are more for the fall bees. If you want to see the full list of specialists and all of their host plants, I definitely recommend this great website here. We have plenty of other woody plants that have specialists too, though. So I'll point out our dogwoods, particularly shrubby dogwood species, have 4 different specialist bees. And many more of those ericaceous shrubs, so plants that are related to blueberries, like huckleberries, sheep laurel, rhododendrons, maleberries, and many more, each have their own specialist bee. Here we have deerberry. I mentioned this because we have a grad student who's doing his entire thesis on this, so I always love to make a plug for it. This is an underappreciated relative of blueberries. We'll never find it in the nursery trade yet. But it is the only host plant for one of the rarest bees in the Northeast, the deerberry blunt-horned bee. And who would have thought the iconic American chestnut, which was formerly a keystone species in our forests and supported wildlife and people alike, it also has a specialist bee, the chestnut mining bee, which we thought went extinct for a hot minute there. This bee is incredibly rare in New York. There's only 2 known populations, and our lab discovered both of them. One of them is actually on SUNY ESF property right in Syracuse. So chestnuts have always been an incredible resource for pollinators as its midsummer blooming tree, and we hope that one day they will be playing their rightful place in our forests. There are really so many amazing woody plants that host specialist bees, like including all of these. And really, bees just have such a long evolutionary history with woody plants here in the Northeast.
So how many
Yes.
plants do you need to support, how many would you need?
It varies.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say for woody plants, fewer than if we were looking at a wildflower. Because it all has to do with how many hundreds of flowers does that bee need to visit to have enough pollen to make a nest. One shrub might have hundreds of flowers on it. One wildflower might be 1 flower. So usually the threshold is lower if it's a specialist on a woody plant. We don't know for most species, unfortunately. That's something we really don't have a good idea of.
Oh.
So
Okay.
active area of research. But of course, let's not forget our friends, the caterpillars. Butterflies and moths have just as strong a relationship with woody plants as bees do, if not more. The vast majority of caterpillars eat woody plants, and so they are really vital to supporting our ecosystems. Here we can see the plants that support the most caterpillar species, and oaks alone host over 500 different types of butterflies and moths. The top herbaceous plants, which include goldenrods and asters, each host about 100, which is not too shabby at all, but it's still a 5-to-1 ratio.
So when we hear in the news where like these trees in various spots are under attack by certain, what's happening? Like is there they don't have a natural predator that's on them? Like I hear like some of these trees that have to get torn down because of the
Like emerald ash borer and things like that. So that's mainly, there's a number of our native keystone trees like this that are under attack by invasive pathogens or invasive insects. Yes, it's because they don't have a natural defense to them. We haven't developed any sort of biocontrol or found any predator that's effective yet. So again, another very active area of research. Oaks definitely are starting to come under attack by there's a new pathogen for oaks, there's one for elms, there's one for ashes, it's a whole thing. But we still need them very much on our landscape, so planting them is important. And yeah, we've got great scientists on that. We can see this full list of keystone woody plants from the famous work of Dr. Doug Tallamy in his book, Bringing Nature Home. These keystone plants include things like willows, cherries, we have blueberries, pines, hickories, ash, pretty much any common woody plant in the landscape you can think of are really important for caterpillars. These are pretty much common plants that have evolved to have a huge number of relationships with other species, and that makes them important. You'll also notice that these plants are the same ones that we've already seen on a few other slides. And that's because there's a lot of overlap in the plants that support the bulk of ecosystem function for both insects and wildlife in our region. You really can't go wrong with adding in woodies like oaks, willows, blueberries, pairing that with goldenrods, asters, and milkweed. I think those like 6 plants alone do so much to support pollinators. These keystone plants can also be really good for areas if you have a small space or have a limited budget where you can only just choose a few things to plant. These are the ones that will have probably the most disproportionately large impact for the ecosystem. Apart from all these things, there is an extensive list of other woody plants that are great. These are just a few of them. The one you see here is northern bush honeysuckle, which is not related to the invasive honeysuckles. This is our native one. It is a beautiful shrub with these yellow flowers that attracts all these long-tongued pollinators, and it has this really nice maroon foliage in fall. It's very nice, but all of these are great. I hope we can provide some inspiration for your gardens. But apart from just providing floral resources, woody plants are important structural components of pollinator habitat too. Coarse woody debris like logs and snags are nesting sites for our green and blue sweat bees, our eastern carpenter bees, our mason bees. Anyone with a deck knows that paper wasps use wood to help make their nests. And it's also that important food source for our pollinating longhorn beetles. Most of these longhorns are specialized to use just one type of tree wood. So the tree community that you have around you will determine what beetles you have. And I think that's pretty cool. Just one down here, one of my favorite pollinating beetles is the chestnut longhorn. It primarily uses chestnut trees. That's a common one you might see. You could probably use something else as a host too, given how chestnuts are not around much anymore, but it is highly dependent on chestnuts. We also have small carpenter bees that nest in blackberry canes and sumac trees. We have bumblebees that often nest in root hollows at the base of trees. And we have many sweat bees that will actually nest in large numbers in the clumps of dirt that stick to roots when large trees fall over in the forest. So very important in a variety of ways. And the last thing I'll emphasize here is our leaf litter. Leaf litter is an essential part of pollinator habitat, and many of our pollinators, particularly caterpillars, queen bumblebees, and some of our springtime butterflies, like the mourning cloaks here, are overwintering in or below the leaf litter. This is important protection from the cold and from predators while they hibernate. So it is important that we keep fallen leaves on our property whenever possible, so pollinators that we're trying to support the rest of the year actually can survive the winter. These caterpillars are dropping down from their host plants and they're hoping to find a soft landing of leaves that are beneath. It's woody plants that make up most of these leaves and create this part of the habitat that we don't often give much thought to, but it's just as important as flowers are. So ultimately, how can we help our pollinators? We can bring back native plants in our yards, in our neighborhoods, and around our communities. Pollinators need many resources for many reasons, and hopefully I've brought some light to the role that trees and shrubs play in making this habitat. Certainly not trying to downplay the importance of wildflowers, but hopefully garner some appreciation for the woodies as well. To make colorful, diverse pollinator habitat, we can do things like mix and match the showy garden favorites with some of the keystone trees and shrubs, and throw in some specialist host plants. That will all help fill that bloom turnover that we need and support a wide array of both common and rare pollinators. And what's important here is that what you do in your individual yard does matter. It might seem like a small space, but insects are small too, and that makes them pretty easy to care for. What happens is that when we get more and more people making these little habitat patches, they will start to connect into larger habitat corridors. These corridors are greater than the sum of their parts. They can support many more species than any individual isolated patch on its own. And it allows pollinators and wildlife to move across the landscape safely and find what they need. Even if you can only plant a single tree, you are helping to build that pollinator corridor and you are making a difference. If you make some habitat, we encourage you to get it certified by any great nonprofits and to document what you see using citizen science. Rare bees show up in yards all the time, and you can help scientists like me document these populations of declining species. The last thing I'll add is our Bee Campus website. We have a whole page of resources for the public, including plant recommendations, a directory of all the native nurseries in New York State to help get these plants, and more information about these topics in general and the work we do on the ESF. So thanks everyone for having me here. If there's any time left over, I'll take questions. And if you want to learn more about our lab, or reach out to me, my info is down. So thank you guys.
We'll take one or two questions now, and I have it on authority that Molly's going to hang around a little bit later, so you'll be able to get her for questions after this, but we'll take one or two now.
Yes.
My daughter and my sister-in-law both have problems with bees getting into the house. What type of bee are those? Are they different than the pollinator type bees?
Yeah, so most of the time when I hear things like that, it's usually yellow jackets. They do get into houses. They're not bees, they're wasps. So the species that end up coming into conflict with people are generally our social wasps or our social bees. The solitary species, you almost never notice in your day-to-day life, and they don't come into houses that do anything because they don't have hives, they don't have colonies, they're not in large numbers anymore. So 99% of the time it's yellow jackets. They're the ones that we've had them actually in our walls as well. So they do sometimes get into the foundation of houses, and you might have to call someone for that. So it's usually a yellow jacket species. If it's on the outside of the house, it's probably the paper wasps. Yellow jackets are more like the subterranean or interior type of one. So it's probably yellow jackets. Yellow jackets are pollinators, but since they are a social insect, they can sometimes be problematic and disruptive because they do form large colonies that can become aggressive. So yes, it's probably yellow jackets.
All right, thank you.
Yes. Yes.
They all make honey or just honey?
Just honeybees. Yes. So any bee will, the reason they make honey is because those honeybee colonies live for many years. They survive through the winter. They store all of that energy that they forage in the summer as honey that they can eat during the winter. Most other bees do not survive the winter, and most don't live in colonies. So therefore, all of these solitary bees, or solitary wasps, they are just provisioning enough food for the offspring that will be the next generation. The adults die and they don't It's just the egg that is left behind. Yeah, and so for that reason, young solitary wasps are eating like animal protein, so the adults will catch like a stink bug or a caterpillar or a grasshopper, put it in the nest, that's what they eat. For bees, it's gonna be pollen. And so that's what they leave behind, it's just a ball of pollen. There's no honey in any case. Even bumblebees that are social bees, their colonies are very small. They don't survive the winter. Only the next year's queen survives, and they hibernate on the leaf litter. They don't stay in the nest. So therefore, it's really just honeybees, which are 4 species out of 20,000 that make honey. We do have what are called the native stingless bees of Central America that do make honey, and the native peoples there do farm them for honey. They're really cool. We don't have those here, but so the stingless bees and the honeybees, 4 species, are the only ones in the whole world that make any honey in any amount that we can harvest. Yes.
How far do bees fly to pollinate? What's their range?
Yeah. So active area of research, as many things.
Okay.
Small bees do not fly very far.
Okay.
Typically, bees can be very small, much smaller than people think. Our average bee is probably about 5 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch long. Some bees are the size of a pinhead. I happen to be lucky enough to have seen the smallest bee in the world, Perdica minima. It's in Arizona. It is the size of a period of 80 sentences. So, and they are a specialist on a tiny little sand mat removed from that one area. So most bees that are that small usually are flying a couple 100 feet at most from the nest. So most of what they need needs to be in the immediate area. Larger bees, as you scale up, a bee like this mining bee here can probably fly a couple 1,000 feet. So we usually measure in meters, 1,000 meters around. And then bumblebees, honeybees can fly in like 13 kilometers, like 10 miles or something. They can fly if they wanted to. Bumblebees probably a couple miles. But there's a difference between how long they can travel and how long they want to travel. So the longer they have to go out, the more the nest is open to parasites or predators, the more chance that they could get hit by a car or eaten by a bird. And chances are they'll die sooner because they're exhausting themselves. So they really, if the habitat is good, they will fly as little from the nest as possible. And that's what we want to do for them, is make sure they have enough that they don't need to cross roads and don't need to go out to risky places.
Well, let's thank
I'm happy to
Molly
answer
again.
afterwards. Yeah, I'll let you get on with yours there, but I'll be around. Thanks so much for coming.
That was awesome.
Stay-
Thank you.